Nous sommes le Subcommittee des droits internationaux.
Welcome to the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, April 29th, 2014, we're holding our 23rd meeting.
My threats to Mr. Sims that he had to leave the room immediately or face the wrath of the Speaker. We are actually doing the in-camera stuff at the end of this meeting, not at the beginning. So my apologies in absentia to Scott Sims. We have today with us William Browder, who is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management. He is giving us an update on the situation that relates to Sergei Magnitsky. You will all recall, of course, from a previous hearing some time ago that the story of Sergei Magnitsky, which I will not repeat, and the reaction of the Russian government to attempts to seek out justice for Mr. Magnitsky. We're now getting an update on that situation. Anybody who has an interest in it can speak to our analysts or our clerk and get the minutes of that former proceeding in order to gain any additional contextual information. With that being said, I turn the floor, Mr. Browder, over to you. Normally, we have more or less a 10-minute opening statement, but you can do it more quickly or less quickly. In the end, that just affects how much time is available for each of the question and answers that will take place in the remaining available time. So
Wonderful.
Please begin.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity today to tell you about the story of Sergei Magnitsky in Russia, and thank you for your continued vigilance on this story. This is my third opportunity to address the Parliament here in Canada, and I'm very grateful. There's a lot of terrible things that happen in the world, and I'm very grateful for you giving me and Sergei's family the opportunity to tell the story. Now, most of you have heard this story, and so I'm not going to tell the whole story again, but just to summarize it in 30 seconds and then tell you what's happened since I was last here explaining the story. As most of you will remember, Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer. I was a large investment fund manager in Russia. When I was there, I discovered corruption in the companies that I invested in. I exposed the corruption, and in response, the Russian government expelled me from Russia and declared me a threat to national security. I then evacuated all my staff, took all of my firm's assets out of the country, and then the authorities raided my offices after that, seized all of our documents, and I hired this young lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate what they were going to do with the seized documents, and he discovered that the documents were used to perpetuate a $230 million tax rebate fraud, not fraud against the Russian government, not against me. Sergei, who was both a good lawyer and a good patriot, exposed the theft of the money and the people involved. He was then arrested by some of the same people he testified against, put in pretrial detention, tortured for 358 days in pretrial detention, and ultimately killed on November 16th, 2009, at the age of 37. On November 17th, 2009, when I got the news of his murder, it pretty much changed my life forever. And I put aside my activities as a businessman, and I became a full-time campaigner for justice for Sergei Magnitsky and for other people who are suffering the same fate in Russia. And I've spent the last 4 years traveling around the world looking for justice. And in that time, I've come across a number of different ideas that I'll tell you about today, which have allowed us, I wouldn't call them real justice, but allowed us to get some, or I'd say prick the bubble of impunity that exists in Russia today. So when after Sergei was killed, we tried in every way possible to get the people who killed him to be prosecuted in Russia. And the Russian authorities completely circled the wagons, exonerated every single person who was involved in Sergei Magnitsky's death. But they not only exonerated them, they promoted a number of the key people, and they even gave special state honors, national state honors, to some of the people who were most complicit in the whole Magnitsky story. And so it became obvious to me, in the midst of this whole situation, that if we wanted to get justice, we're going to have to go outside of Russia to get justice. We then said to ourselves, what kind of justice can we get outside of Russia? And the answer was that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky didn't kill him for ideological reasons. They didn't kill him for religious reasons. They killed him for money. They killed him because he discovered the theft of $230 million from his own government, and he testified against the people involved. And they wanted to silence the witness. And the one thing that we felt was that if they killed him for money, then the people who got this money, they generally like to spend it in the West, to save it in the West. They don't actually feel comfortable keeping their money in Russia, because as easily as they stole it from the government, it could be stolen from them by other people. And so we came up with this idea of imposing visa sanctions and asset freezes on the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And I originally took the idea to the U.S. Congress, and I presented it to a number of senators and members of the House of Representatives. And I phrased the question very simply. How would you like to support a piece of legislation to ban Russian torturers and murderers from coming into America? And the answer is pretty straightforward. There's nobody who would be against that. And so slowly but surely, something called the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act worked its way through the U.S. Congress. And on November 2012, it was passed into law. And the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act sanctions those people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, but more importantly, they sanction all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. I would describe this as the new technology for dealing with human rights abuse. This is it. In the old world, 35 or 40 years ago, when the people committed human rights abuses in Russia, they didn't have assets in the West. They didn't travel to New York and Toronto and Saint-Tropez and London. But now they do. And so, and the Russians' reaction to the Magnitsky Act was furious. They were absolutely furious. Putin was furious, and he was furious because it touched him exactly in his Achilles heel. This is the one thing, this is the one place where we have leverage, where we have vulnerability, or where we have leverage and they have vulnerability. And so my mission now is to take this concept and expand it so that not just the United States bans the people who killed Magnitsky and the people who commit other gross human rights abuses, but the Canadian government does, that the European Union does, and that member states of the European Union do. And I was here 2 years ago asking for the same thing to happen in Canada, and Erwin Kotler has proposed a private member's bill basically proposing the same legislation here in Canada. And 2 years ago, there was some reluctance in Canada, and it's not just Canada where there's reluctance. There was reluctance in America. There's reluctance in Europe. But we're now living in a different world where the thought 2 years ago was we don't want to upset Russia. We don't want to. It's a delicate strategic relationship. Well, Russia is now in a state of mind where they don't seem to mind upsetting the rest of the world. They're aggressively acquiring territory that doesn't belong to them. They're openly lying about it to the world leaders. And sanctions are no longer a crazy idea of Bill Browder's, but this is the basic concept which has now been employed about the people involved in invading in Crimea and invading Ukraine. And so my hope is that this will be a concept which can be expanded beyond just the geostrategic discussions about invading Ukraine and deal with the human rights abuses that exist in Russia. And I should point out that all of the world's attention right now is on Donetsk and Slavyansk and Kharkiv and various other places where the Russian agents or troops or pro-Russian separatists, if you want to use that term, are all gathered. But while this is all going on, the Russians continue to tighten the screws in every possible way on their own people. And if you're an anti-corruption activist, if you're a human rights activist, if you're a journalist, if you're involved in any type of non-conventional religion, if you're a member of the LGBT community, you're being persecuted in Russia. And those people have absolutely no recourse right now unless something like a Magnitsky Act is imposed. And so I've come here today to suggest, implore, ask for you to consider again the proposal by Erwin Kotler, and perhaps make it a proposal by the entire committee of implementing a Magnitsky Act in Canada so that Russian torturers and murderers aren't allowed to come here and keep their money here.
Conclude your comments?
What's that?
Are your comments concluding
Yes.
now? Okay, thank you. Just before we go to anything else, we're going to have, given the time, we're going to have 6 minutes available for each question and answer round. That will allow us to wrap things up and devote a couple of minutes, and I think we'll only need a couple, to the in-camera item that has come up, because I think we're merely acting on a consensus. Am I correct? Okay. So just a couple of preliminary things before we go to our first questioner. I received a book sent, I think, by one of your colleagues called Why Europe Needs a Magnitsky Law. So I'm just drawing it to people's attention. I'm assuming that it got sent to other members of the committee. If it did not, I have a copy. Our clerk cannot distribute it because it's in one official language only, but you're welcome to come to my office and see it. The second thing is, just before we go, I just want to be clear about this. You made a reference to what was going on, has been recently going on in Ukraine, but to be clear, Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian citizen. I assume he was a patriotic Russian citizen acting out of a desire to make his country a better place for other Russian citizens, and this in no way overlapped in any respect with current Russian foreign policy, just to be clear.
The only overlap between the Magnitsky case and what's going on right now is the Magnitsky case was an emblematic example of how Russia defies laws and goes about covering up crimes and publicly lying. But Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian citizen exposing a crime against his own country and was murdered by his own government, and it was then covered up by his own government, going right up to Vladimir Putin. And so the mindset of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky is the same mindset that allows Russia to invade Ukraine and do various other things, but there's no overlap in terms of the facts of the case.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Sweet, would you like to? Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Graywall. Ms. Graywall, would you like to begin the questioning?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Mr. Browder for presenting in our committee today. Well, you have shed light on an extremely important human rights issue. What happened to Sergei Magnitsky is a truly very shocking and heinous violation of human rights. It is unfortunate, an example of what many more freedom-loving Russians continue to experience within Russia. So to your knowledge, to what extent has the Russian government deteriorated in terms of Russian citizens who are kind of interested in the democratic process and how they are treated?
Vladimir Putin is running a system where any time that anybody presents any possible alternative to his rule, he then eliminates those people. So, for example, a very popular young politician, activist, blogger named Alexei Navalny started to complain about government corruption and expose huge government corruption in his country. And this young man ended up becoming so popular that he had the potential, if there was a real democratic process, to become president of Russia. And so what Putin did was they trumped up a number of absolutely objectively ludicrous criminal charges against him, prosecuted him on the basis of charges that anybody would say were completely unjust, and then convicted him. When he was convicted, 10,000 people went out on the streets of Moscow and protested, and Putin realized that if they actually put him in jail, that potentially could cause an uprising. And so they then put him under house arrest and refused to allow him any access to any technology, so he's effectively neutered. There's another fellow named Udaltsov, who's a member of the opposition, and again, he was convicted of various crimes and put under house arrest. This is what they do. They either don't register your party, convict you of a crime, attack you, in some cases murder you, to make sure that nobody wants to become a member of the opposition in Russia. And so Putin is effectively, he's like an athlete who's cheating. He can't tolerate any competition, and so he just eliminates anybody who might potentially be his competition. And so and now he's also eliminating any possibility that any journalist organization says anything bad about him. Any journalist organization that has been in any way supportive of the opposition is now being shut down in Russia.
And how should democratic countries like Canada, the United States, and those within the European Union work together and respond to Russia's human rights violations? So bearing in mind that Russia is a nuclear power.
Well, the historic response to that question, it's not just Canada, it's every other country in the world, says let's just not do anything about it. That has been the historic. Let's just not do anything. And as a result of that, Putin has enjoyed absolute impunity, and it's actually emboldened him to invade neighboring countries. Because Putin is a kleptocrat, and it's now sort of widely acknowledged that he's a kleptocrat, and he doesn't keep his money in Russia, the one thing we can do is sanction him. In other words, sanction his money. Freeze his assets so that his money is no longer safe. I don't think that Putin will start a nuclear war over his money being frozen, and I don't think that this is the one thing where, because he can't really acknowledge that he has any money. And so this is the way this is their Achilles heel. This is the main way that we can get to them in the West, which they can't really, there's no reciprocal way that they can go about doing anything about this.
Thank you. Chair, do I have some more time left? 1 minute. I'll pass my time to Mr. Sweet. Mr. Sweet.
Well, thank you very much. Just a quick question. For the people who are watching it, how is it that someone like Sergei could uncover the fact that people were stealing from the government, and then government officials actually make sure that he's incarcerated and then later killed? Why would those people who did that be given state honors afterwards if he was stealing money from that very government? If they were stealing money from that very government, sorry.
We had the same question. And there's an assumption you're making in that question, which is that the people who are running the country are acting in the national interest. So if you change that assumption just slightly, and you say that people who are running the country are kleptocrats and who are benefiting from either this particular scam or many scams like it, then that changes the assumptions that you make about the answer to the question. So if somebody who's let's just say that there are senior ministers in the government who are benefiting from this, and who also have the ability to award state honors and also the ability to arrest a young man who exposed the crime, then it's entirely logical. If they're the crooks who are doing the crime, then they have every power to then cover up the crime and do that. And what the Sergei Magnitsky story did, probably better than any other story in Russia because the details are so clear, is it put the bare face of Russia out there for everybody to see. Not just for this case, but for every case, because this is just a tip of an iceberg. It just happens to be a well-documented iceberg where I have the opportunity to come and speak to you about it. But this is going on everywhere on a grand scale, and it's not just going on in Russia. It went on in Ukraine. That's why the president of Ukraine was run out of the country, because people couldn't tolerate it anymore. And it completely ruins the life of average Russians, because the money doesn't go to build hospitals and schools. The money goes to villas and yachts and foreign bank accounts and fancy prep schools for their children. And that's where the whole problem is.
That used both of the 1 minute available, if you follow. And we go now to Mr. Marsden. I think, in all fairness, because I want to get to the end, I'm going to, in situations like this, if we run over, subtract it from the next time, so we'll have 5 minutes when we get back to you. Mr. Marsden?
Well, I think that's very fair, Mr. Chair. I'm of the generation, Mr. Browder, of MAD, mutually assured destruction. And that was a two-edged sword, because everybody thought that would prevent nuclear war. And by the fact that everybody thought that, then Russia was free to do a lot of things, and they, without really believing anybody would take them up to the challenge because of the risk factor. But I don't see, I tend to agree with your analysis that Mr. Putin's not prepared to die for his money, but I wouldn't want to be proven wrong on that. One of the things that I'd like to ask you is, and our researchers have brought this question to us, and I think it's very pertinent. Considering Mr. Kotler's motion he had before I ask the question, though, are you aware of any interactions with government members seeking support on that bill, and what kind of reaction they've been getting?
We've just arrived here in Ottawa this morning, so I'm going to be actually meeting with the government tomorrow about this. All I can say from a predictive standpoint is that we're now in a completely different world where nobody is trying to make nice with the Russians, and the sanctions have already been imposed already, and so the leap of faith to impose sanctions and leap of faith that we're worried about upsetting Russia is neither of them are big leaps of faith now. What we have is a situation where I was sort of in the wilderness for the last 4 years. So a lot of people were saying, maybe this Magnitsky case is just some obscure case. Maybe it's an extreme example. And now all of a sudden, every government is interested in my opinions about who to sanction, and every news station is interested in about whether the sanction policies are appropriate or should be strengthened or not. And so I'm now in the mainstream as far as my thoughts about sanctions. And so I'm hoping that since the world has changed, we can actually use this tool properly, which is as I said, this is sort of the iPad of the iPad technology. We used to be on typewriters. Now we have an iPad as far as fighting human rights abuse. The idea of going after these people's money, and we're not just talking about going after heads of state or senior government officials. In the case of Magnitsky, we're talking about mid-level people who won't be able to travel, who can't use their Visa card anymore, and then the question is, do they take the order to do something bad if they know that they're going to personally be held accountable and not be able to travel and use their money, and their government can't protect them from that?
Well, the very impunity that they've lived under for so long. I mean, North America is quite aware of the gangster problem in Russia, and you seem to have some really direct information linking certain people that you've attested to before, which would put you in a rather unique position compared to all of the things that are happening. The reason I started this line of thought, though, is My understanding, there's Canadian law that already addresses the provision to prevent individuals from entering Canada if they're suspected of committing more serious types of crimes or criminal organizations. And you sound to me like you have the kind of evidence that it could be used against at least a number of these people. So, do you believe if we took the existing law and applied it, that would be good enough to address this particular situation?
Well, the law prevents people from entering Canada, but it doesn't oblige the government. First of all, it allows the government to prevent them if it chooses to. It doesn't oblige them to, and it doesn't freeze their assets.
Okay.
And it doesn't name their names. So there's three things about the Magnitsky Act which are unique, useful, and goes beyond what exists under current legislation in Canada, and the U.S. version went beyond current legislation in the United States, which is the first thing, it requires the government to name the names publicly on a federal register, which is extremely important. The second is that it obliges them to freeze their visas, or to ban their visas, and then it freezes their assets, which doesn't exist under current legislation. And I can tell you one thing, which is that it's hard to appreciate it if you're not a specialist on sanctions, and I've just become a specialist on sanctions through this exercise. But if a person's name is on an international sanctions list, that's pretty much the end of their financial life. If you're on a sanctions list, whether you're on a Canadian sanctions list, a U.S. sanctions list, a European sanctions list, even on one and not all three, every bank in the world runs a database of who's on the sanctions list. Every bank. And if someone's on a Canadian sanctions list and no other sanctions list, they won't be able to open an account at RBS in London. Most companies won't want to do business with them when they do their due diligence on that person. And even if they have no assets in Canada, naming and shaming them and putting them in that position has a very material and very direct and negative impact on their lives. And the existing legislation doesn't do that.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
I have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds. That's it.
I think it's over. Well, we tried.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
We next go to Mr. Schellenberger.
Thank you, and thank you again for your coming back. I think I was new on the committee when you were here previously, and I found the story to be horrendous, and that has never left me. It's never left me even through the Ukraine situation. I look at the former president and the former government. They were really Putin cronies. They were put in place, and they looked after themselves first. It was my understanding. It's my understanding that Putin's wealth, I heard it somewhere, was in the neighborhood of $160 billion. $160 billion. I don't think as president of Russia, the paychecks would get you to that particular spot. So that, to anyone that knows, but if the regular Russian people don't know that, if the media can't put that out, if it's not out there, they'd wonder why they average about $12,000 a year. It'd take a long time to get to 160 billion. Everything that you told us when you were here the last time, I more than believe wholeheartedly, especially since what happened in Crimea, in Ukraine. And I was a little different than even what our government was at the very beginning, or European government, the United States. When this first happened, when the Ukrainian president left and went back to Russia, I'd have put sanctions on everyone, all the oligarchs, everyone in Ukraine and in Russia. And I know one of my staffers was in Europe this past Christmas, and I don't know exactly which resort area it was, but over half the houses, the big mansions and everything were owned by Russians. Most of the Russians and Ukrainian top people all live outside. They just take the money from there and out. So I do believe in sanctions. And the one thing, I know you've explained sanctions enough. Do you think that there are enough been put in place already?
The answer is absolutely not. Everybody there's a lot of negotiating among ourselves that's going on here in the West in relation to Russia. So, so in relation to Ukraine, I believe that the best way of dealing with this situation would be to sanction all of the cabinet of the cabinet ministers, all of them, sanctioning Putin, and then sanctioning a wide swath of what I call oligarch trustees. And just to explain to you, the way that the kleptocracy works is most government officials don't keep the money in their own names. They keep the money in the names of people they trust, and these are the trustees. And so when you look at these rich lists of Russians, oftentimes they're not as rich as they look on the list because they're holding assets on behalf of Vladimir Putin and other senior government ministers. And I believe that the closest anyone has come to a sort of half-satisfactory lists are the U.S. sanctions lists that have come out, because they've actually gone after businessmen, and some very well-known businessmen. Not nearly enough businessmen. The Canadian list that just came out had 2 businessmen on it today, which is better than no businessmen. The European list had no businessmen on it. And the businessmen are the guys who hold the money for Putin and his colleagues. And that's what it really, and those are the people who need to be sanctioned as far as this whole Ukrainian military adventure of Putin's. And then as far as these human rights abuses, nobody has been sanctioned. Nobody's been sanctioned in Canada for the Magnitsky murder. We have all the evidence. They've been sanctioned in America. I don't understand why Canada couldn't just take the American list and adopt it, or some version of it. I could come here and spend a week with the immigration minister's staff and share with them the evidence, and I don't know why they're not sanctioned. They should be. No.
I think what...
Got 1 minute.
I got 1 minute. I think what's happened, Putin, the Russians have lulled everyone kind of to sleep a little wee bit, and trust me, and then you can see what's happened in Syria. They brokered that deal, or supposedly brokered that deal that still hasn't been completed. And if you just see the countries that they're friends of, it's terrible. So again, I say thank you to yourself for all the work you have done to try to straighten out some of the wrongs that are and have been in Russia, and we'll see if we can't support some of your issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Extremely fascinating presentation. In terms of the judiciary in Russia, because, you know, I understand how you can have corrupt government officials and you know, basically gangsters on the loose, you know, arresting, you know, working with the police to arrest someone like Mr. Magnitsky on false pretenses. But in our system, you know, sort of the judiciary is the backstop. You know, it prevents these abuses from. So, is the judiciary in Russia totally complicit with the corruption? Or, you know, are judges being bought off, or are they just simply scared of reprisals? What's the role of the judiciary in all this in Russia?
Well, you're absolutely right that in normal countries the judiciary is the sort of check and balance, the backstop, the way of keeping everything working. And your suspicion is also correct that the judiciary in Russia completely does not function as a normal, independent law applying body. The judiciary in Russia is at every step, at every level of the judiciary, from the lowest level right up to the Supreme Court, is corrupt. It's corrupt both on a financial basis and on a political basis. Sometimes people pay money for decisions, and other times people make phone calls for decisions. And I think that probably the most poignant example of the judicial corruption comes again in the Magnitsky case. And I'm not just being sort of myopic or self-centered when I say this, that in July of last year, a senior judge in Moscow held a trial that ran for about 2 months, in which Sergei Magnitsky was the defendant 3 years after he died.
It's unbelievable.
The first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia was held in Moscow last summer.
It's unbelievable. Now, that brings me to another question about the mechanics of your initiative and how your bill is carried out. How do you gather evidence? Like, we're dealing with people who are operating in another country, in a country that is corrupt, whose police records can't be trusted, whose judiciary, as you've just mentioned, is corrupt. So how do you get evidence to decide to seize this person's assets? Assets are seized under the Act. Yeah. How do you get evidence to do that? And how do you know the evidence is valid?
Well, the evidence. Evidence is in our case, the way that the evidence was gathered is that the authorities in Russia have this strange way of thinking that nobody's ever going to look at what they've done from the outside, and so they document everything. So when Sergei Magnitsky was beaten on the last night of his life, there's a protocol written and signed by the people who were involved in the beating, just to confirm to their boss that they did their job properly. There's every piece of paper in Sergei's case file showing he's requesting medical attention and showing judges rejecting his requests for medical attention.
And how do you get your hands on this evidence?
Well, the one thing about Russia which is interesting is that it's a totally unjust system, but they're absolutely wedded to their procedure. So you go to court, they present their case file in court, you have an opportunity to look at their case file, and they've pretty much damned themselves in their own defense. Maybe they didn't get into trouble in their own courts because the courts ruled, sort of obtusely in the wrong way on every single thing that ever happened, but the evidence is there, the evidence that they created.
So you have the Magnitsky Act in the U.S. How many are there other countries that have similar legislation, or is this the U.S. stand alone at this point?
So the U.S. has the legislation. The European Parliament recently did something which is very unusual for the European Parliament, which was they passed a resolution in which they've attached their own sanctions list. The European Parliament has attached a sanctions list of 32 people involved in the Magnitsky case. The European Parliament has never in their history put a sanctions list together. The reason that they put a sanctions list together was because they've passed 4 resolutions in the past 4 years calling on the European Union to impose sanctions, and the European Union as an executive body has ignored the Parliament. And so they decided to come up with their own sanctions list, which they're then going to distribute to all the embassies in all of the European embassies in Russia, so that the consular officers at least have the names.
But the individual countries aren't empowered yet to take the same kinds of action.
There's been no executive decision taken by any of the European countries. The British government, strangely, has been sort of lying by omission. They've stated on the record that the people who killed Magnitsky aren't allowed into the country, and then they were asked again on the record whether the people are not allowed into the country, and they say we can't say who's allowed into the country. We don't talk about who's not allowed. And so The answer is very simply that only the United States has an explicit Magnitsky Act. It's my job and my mission to change that.
One last question, Chair.
Overtime. I apologize for that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Sweet, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Browder, I think every lawyer in the world would want to have you as their friend or someone like you if they ever got into a circumstance like this. And I'm not trying to make light of it. This is an absolute tragedy that happened to Sergei Magnitsky, but your dedication is exemplary to what anybody could ever hope for from anybody, best friend or whatever. So I just want to commend you on that. And last July, it wasn't only a dead man who was on trial, but it seems that your efforts must be at least a little bit effective because they tried you in absentia as well. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so just to complete the story, there were two defendants in July, Sergei Magnitsky, who's dead, and me, who is alive but not in Russia. It was the first trial, posthumous trial in Russian history, and it was the second trial against a Westerner in absentia. So in the court, they have a cage for defendants, and there was an empty cage in this particular case. We didn't participate in the trial because it was completely trumped up, neither Sergei's families or myself. And so two state-appointed lawyers showed up unwillingly. They were asked to show up, and they showed up to the court, and then they asked to be excused since their clients, their supposed clients, didn't want to have any contact with them. The government demanded that they participate, otherwise they would be disbarred. And so they basically went on with this show trial, and it was a show trial in every possible sense of the word, and convicted Sergei and convicted me and sentenced me to 9 years in prison in absentia. The Russians went to Interpol to try to have me put on the Interpol most wanted list, and thankfully Interpol rejected them because the case was in their words, politically motivated and illegitimate. They've gone to a number of countries, including the UK, asking them to hand me over. The UK has rejected it. A number of other countries have openly said that if I ever come there, nothing would happen. But the Russians, when they this is what they do. When they get mad at you, they open a criminal case. There's a famous saying, "Find me the man, and I'll find you a crime." This was a Stalin quote, and or maybe it's Dzerzhinsky. I can't remember which one. And that's what they do. I clearly upset them profoundly, and it wasn't just because of the Magnitsky Act. We've also been able to trace the money that was stolen and get different law enforcement agencies around the world to seize that money. The United States, Switzerland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Cyprus, Moldova, and various other countries have opened criminal cases. And what this has done is it's also exposed what I call the money laundering pipe that's used by the entire criminal organization of the government. And so I'm an extremely dangerous character for them because I've done something which I've taken their dirty laundry and put it out for the whole world to see.
This, going back to the time when you actually began business in Russia, this obviously was how the government operated, etc. This was obviously a huge surprise to you. While you were there, obviously your communications are strained now with any sources there, but I would think you may have some. But what was the awareness in the average individual? You must have had lots of interactions with Russian citizens. Are they totally oblivious to this? Are they stymied by fear of the government? Have they just dealt with this so long it's everyday practice?
The Russians are a very fatalistic people. They're highly aware of everything that goes on. They don't know the details necessarily, but they know the general. I mean, they can see it for themselves. The roads have, the roads that are supposed to have been, they were supposed to have gotten $1 billion to build a road, and there's no road. The hospital that was supposed to buy new machines doesn't have any machines. So everybody knows that this is going on, and they're infuriated by it. And any person who had ever run on any ticket to change the corruption, to stop it, would win in a landslide if they were allowed to run. And so basically most people, and so the Russian government does what they did to Sergei Magnitsky, they do on maybe not quite as extremely on a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. And so everybody's afraid to speak up about it. Everybody is afraid to do anything about it, and so they're subjected to it. And that's what that's what a corrupt authoritarian regime does, is they scare their people, they steal them, and they scare their people into saying anything.
How many other cases, other than Sergei Magnitsky's, are you trying to raise the awareness of in the international community in regards to human rights violations in Russia?
Well, there's a lot of cases that are directly connected to the Magnitsky case that where we found. I mean, there was a case involving a young man named Fyodor Mikheyev, who was arrested by the very same police officers who arrested Sergei Magnitsky. They arrested him, and then they handed him over to some kidnappers who demanded a $20 million ransom for him from his boss. His wife got involved and somehow found out where he was and got him freed by the police, and then he was then rearrested and sentenced to 11 years in prison. And so when we were making movies about our case, we included the Mikheyev case in our case, in our movies. And what we've discovered is that there's multiple crimes that Sergei discovered, multiple of the same types of tax rebate frauds going up to $1 billion that we've then exposed as well. I'm actually going to be in Washington next week, and I'm introducing the young ladies from Pussy Riot to various senators there to try to get some of the people who were involved in their persecution added to the Magnitsky list. And so there's kind of a growing movement of people. The problem is everybody's problem in Russia, and so the more that this stuff overlaps with us, the more we want to get everyone else involved, because we're never going to bring Sergei back, but if we can create consequences and save lives for others through his sacrifice, that would be a meaningful legacy for him.
Sweet. With the permission of the committee, may I ask one question? Your mention of Pussy Riot raises something that has been mysterious to me, and perhaps you can provide the answer to it. It is not difficult to understand the motivation, the financial motivation that leads to someone like Sergei Magnitsky being crushed by the system. But I am mystified by the desire of the Russian regime to crush its LGBT community. That just seems totally unconnected. I can't figure out what is the motivator behind it. So I just wondered if you have any idea what's the bee in their bonnet.
It's very simple. So if you're a kleptocrat, if you're Vladimir Putin, you're a kleptocrat, and you're running a kleptocratic state that everybody is furious and fuming just below the surface, where basically 1,000 people have benefited from everything, from all the stealing, and 140 million people haven't. That's an unsustainable regime, and you've got to come up with something to create a distraction. And so Putin has been sort of testing out different ideas, and one of his first ideas that came out about a year ago was this idea of cracking down on the LGBT community, and that the thought there was if he could somehow create this sort of this sort of conservatism, that might distract people, and it didn't. I mean, he tried it out, and it didn't really. No one was paying any attention. And so he moved on to Plan B and Plan C and Plan D. And I don't know exactly where Crimea fits into the lettering of these plans, but he was looking for something to create a distraction. The attack on LGBT, which, by the way, has not stopped. It's going on. It's just nobody is paying attention to it right now as people are looking at Donetsk today. But many people from that community are feeling very, very vulnerable. People are leaving the country. People who aren't leaving the country are feeling totally at risk. They're having to hide their lifestyles in hopes that they don't end up getting persecuted and losing their jobs or possibly worse.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Colleagues, we're going to have to suspend for a moment to go in camera. I'm sorry, was there someone else? Oh, Mr. Benskin, my goodness. I owe you an apology. I would not have asked that question. I completely forgot. So with my apologies, you have 6 minutes.
I'm new to the committee, so I'm new to this story in terms of one, its existence. There's so much happening in the world on a daily basis. You can only read so much news. I would, if you could you elaborate just a bit on sort of the key points of what the Magnitsky Act is? What are the key clause or teeth to this act?
Sure. So the Magnitsky Act is a piece of U.S. legislation at the moment which has three basic features. It publicly names the names of the people who are involved in human rights abuses. It bans them from entering in the U.S. case America, and it freezes the assets and disallows any financial institution or U.S. business to do business with the people who are on that list. The Magnitsky Act applies in America to the people who are involved in the Magnitsky case, and it applies to people involved in other gross human rights abuses, as is recognized by the U.S. government.
And the burden of proof as far as being able to enact those asset freezes?
The burden of proof is very high, and the U.S. government is the ultimate arbiter of who gets on that list and who doesn't. And if a person is put on that list, they have the opportunity to challenge it in federal court. And the person who's put on that list, or the government will only put a person on that list that they can defend to a criminal standard based on evidence. So not on a civil standard, but on a criminal standard that they're on that list.
So in the case of what's happening, for example, happening now in Crimea with Russia and so forth, would there be room? Would there be wiggle room taking the Magnitsky Act as a base to use that same type of thought process on a political level in terms of taking that same process and applying it to members of the Russian Parliament or other leaders within the Russian government?
Well, this is exactly what has happened. The United States has taken the exact concept of the Magnitsky Act and applied it to, I think at this point, there's something like 54 names of people who are put on the federal OFAC sanctions list, have their visas banned, and have their assets frozen on the basis of a criminal standard. The only thing that's maybe different between the current visa bans or the current sanctions and the Magnitsky sanctions is I'm not sure whether the people on the Ukrainian sanctions have the ability to go to U.S. court and challenge it. That's my only, and I haven't researched what's the current sanctions to know that. But everything else is exactly the same, sort of effectively sanction for sanction, word for word, consequence for consequence.
Thank you. I will yield my time for any interest of us doing what we need to do.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Benskin. I do apologize again for overlooking the fact that it was your turn. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for a moment. We'll offer our thanks. I will offer our thanks on behalf of everybody to Mr. Browder. You're as informative as you always are, and this is a really important issue. Let's suspend, and then we'll reconvene in camera in just a moment. Thanks.